Well met, everyone. I am Rich the Lich, and today I'm going to be talking you through a bit of world building. You may have seen this map before. I did a bit of work on it last night. What I've done and what's been happening off camera that you have not seen is I created a few forested areas. So down here, there's the Gilded Forest, and then there's Gideon's Hollow. And I started labeling some things. So the labeling part, where you can see here, we've got a bunch of water areas, right? We have Sea of Tendrils, Bay of Embers, Manser Bay, Sea of Air and Vest, South Sea, Sea of Shakal. We have what would be the beginnings. Sorry, I'm finishing my food. The beginnings of some continents or some kingdoms. Tenwai, Ephresia, Elan Barat, Kitajel, Dovesk, Chag, Silkrav, Jahimor, and Lascari. I don't know what's going to be contained there yet. I don't know what kingdom is predominantly what race and who's in charge and who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, who's at war. I haven't gotten that far yet. I do have a little bit of an idea on Jahimor being kind of the main empire, just simply because they're taking up the bulk of sort of the largest continent on the map, right? But, you know, and you can always kind of say things in the north kind of make sense, right? Elan Barat, where you have the snow area, maybe there's some sort of Vikings there, or frost barbarians, or giants and things like that. So what I did with the labeling, though, and why I started labeling things before I finished it, because I still have to create a bunch more mountains. I have more terrain pieces to create. I've got to create some deserts, some hills, the rivers, of course, and just other really cool landmarks and interesting bits. Is when you start world building, one thing you want to do is, first and foremost, find your central theme. So maybe my world is supposed to be very low on resources, where everyone is fighting with bone weapons and magic is forbidden and water is a scarce resource. You know, you can make your world sort of dark sunish. You can make your world just flooded in the north with undead, Game of Thrones stuff, right? Therefore, you need some kind of a wall or a barrier. Maybe your world is very high magic, like Eberron. Find that theme and try and keep it consistent. If you don't have the artistic skill set, you don't have to worry about it looking that consistent in your art. But for the most part, you know, if I have a pirate world, like in this case, there's a lot of water here. There may be a lot of ships, shipping and trade routes, you know, across the oceans and various, you know, ruined areas and places for PCs to go underwater, you know, submerged. Water breathing is a big thing here. Sahagin and merfolk type of creatures, and what are they called? Meros and stuff like that, right? But the point is, find your theme and try and keep that consistent. And then after that, what you really want to do is you want to start focusing on creating a bunch of interesting spots that are almost like mini modules. Really cool, interesting places where you can create a bunch of space where there's like an entire adventure that can happen there. And yes, you can separate it and say that an entire campaign can be run in Tenwai and an entire campaign can be run in Chag. And, you know, you can always divide it up geographically. It doesn't have to be that way. But what I did here, and what I can kind of illustrate on the video, is I created this forested region, and then as I was drawing down in here, I created these kind of hollows, kind of inspired by something I saw. It's somewhere off of the zone of like Winter Spring in World of Warcraft, right? Or the Moonglade or something like this, where there's just this kind of darker elven force, or I think they had like owl bears and various things like that. So I created kind of this cave system. And once I created that, I didn't have any labels yet. I had no continent named Jahimor. I didn't have the God's Lost Peaks over on the right, the Durinveth Woods, nothing like that. I created that, and then I made this label. That was the first thing I made. And I did play around with the aesthetics of what sort of font did I want to use and so on, but I decided to call it Gideon's Hollow. I didn't elaborate on what that was any more than I knew I wanted Gideon's Hollow to be some sort of a dungeon. At whatever level in the writing of this world, because, you know, remember, the intention here is I'm not just creating a cartography thing, a piece, a map. I'm creating this to be the map, to be the visual component of what you would be reading in a 200-300 page campaign setting. A book that can be out there in PDF form or hardcover form that any player or DM can look at and be inspired and want to run and play within this world. So I've got to create content in that regard. I don't want to completely handhold and railroad the DM, so I don't want to lay out every little detail on what Gideon's Hollow might be, but I'll certainly suggest that it's a dungeon. But what it does is no matter where your PCs happen to travel, you can read all these little places. And imagine if I had 30 or 40 of them throughout the world. You have 30 or 40 Curse of Strahds, 30 or 40 Out of the Abyss, 30 or 40 Princes of the Apocalypse or whatever, right? You have 30 or 40 at varying levels, just really cool adventure zones, right? Think of it from a Disneyland concept, just a bunch of different places that cohesively fit together because they follow that theme of this is a very Dark Sun-ish world, or this is a very grim and dark world, or a very high magic world. But there's just a bunch of little interesting spaces for my PCs to show interest in wanting to go there. And as a result, the DM is going to want to create content there. They're going to want to create the encounters and the monsters and the magic items and the lore and the history of that place, okay? So when you have that type of stuff, run with it. And I did that here with Gideon's Hollow, where I knew it was a dungeon. For example, what I'm going to do on camera is I'm kind of going to show you how I would go about the process of creating sort of something interesting, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this green, blue, and I'm going to say that there is this river. I'll doctor this and kind of elaborate on it a little better off camera and create it a little better aesthetically. But just for video purposes, let's pretend there's a river. Makes sense, right? A river coming off of the Arenville Mountains. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of these labels. Okay? And just right here on the fly. Okay? Right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this thing the River Scud. All right? Whether you label all your rivers or not doesn't matter. This one is called River Scud. Now, here's the story of this. Scud, coming up with it here, but this is the process you want to think through with world building, and what happens is at the end of it, you have all these interesting places in your world. Instead of 15,000 years of backstory and history and how the mountains were formed, if I can't create some cool things to do in those mountains, why do my PCs want to go about the mountains or go to the mountains? And if they don't have any interest in going to those mountains, why do they need to know the history of them? You know what I mean? So you have to kind of start to narrow things down into hours of gameplay. Like, always think of it that way, right? Because, again, I've said this before in many videos. If I'm creating a map for, you know, a fiction, a fantasy author, he wrote something and he wants me to make a map based on his world, that's one thing. You're obsessing about the cartography and the detail and the aesthetics and the visuals of a thing. If I'm creating just a map to hang on my wall. But if I'm creating a campaign setting, at the end of the day, whatever I create, whatever I write about, it needs to have something practical that the DM and the players can take and get through 5 hours on a Saturday night. You know what I mean? That's why sometimes the best worlds are ones where there's just a bunch of hooks of fights. That's why thieves guilds, even though you might have, you know, PCs kind of at each other's throats, no pun intended, thieves guilds can work because it's kind of video gamey in that you already know what the mission is. Hey, there's something to steal. Go do it. You know, that's why Skyrim works, is there's always just these constant conflict and challenges that you have to go out and do. You know, a quest pops up, let's do that quest. Too often, a lot of world building in the sense of a campaign setting is too kind of stuck on itself in figuring out why the continents are shaped the way they're shaped. Great, but what does that have to do with my level 1 PCs? What does that have to do with my barbarian who has no interest in ever going into any sort of civilized city type of atmosphere? What does the ancient mages from 14,000 years ago that banned the use of magic? Sure, that can be the sort of foundation to a story, but then what you want to do is you want to say the banned use of that magic has created these corrupted, fiendish, magically infused ogres that are now in the north. Now I have something that the barbarian wants to go fight. Okay? So we have this River Scud. 250 years ago, he's cheating life, right? He's cheating death, I should say. Not cheating life. He's lived longer than he should. There is this ancient hill giant. Okay, and I'm talking something like CR 1819, so way, way, way up there in power. Much more than the average hill giant. He's rivaling storm giants in size, 20, 25 feet tall, in strength, and in power. Okay, now his name is Scud. You can easily say he's evil, and he's going to be something that at high level the PCs are going to want to go kill. He's a problem, but he doesn't have to be. He can be benevolent. He can have a lot of different aspects to him. He's a very complex NPC with many layers, so you're going to want to create some goals and motivations and why does Scud do what he does, right? It's called the River Scud because somewhere in here, what I would do is I would start creating this sort of architecture, okay? And again, I would take this off camera and kind of create a better, visual of what this might look like, right? But I've got this kind of architecture, and Scud has created a home for himself. And basically what he does, I don't know what I'm drawing, whatever the icon is, right? But I can call it, Scud's home, and I can put a cool label there. And as I use the good fonts and stuff like that, it's going to look good. It's going to look just like this one here, right? Gideon's Hollow with the line and all that other good stuff. So the point is Scud has dammed up this river, and he's really fond of the fish that swim through that river. That's all he eats, okay? It's everything to him. And he's dammed up the river a little bit. I mean, the river still flows, but he's definitely slowed it down. And he's so big that he's kind of deforested the area. He's kind of just ransacked through villages and small hamlets and stuff, and he's taken all the timbers and all the trees and the logs, and he's just dumped all the shit into the river, right? And he's blocked it up. And he lives there, and he's lived there for like multiple generations. So he's 250, 300 years old. And whether it's something with the fish or something with the water in the river itself, it's kind of like the fountain of youth, right? And it's allowed him to cheat death, and he just lives long. He can be killed, but age-wise, he's immortal, so to speak. So that's the story of Scud, right? But by creating that little bit there, okay, and creating this architecture, whatever I want it to look like, and Scud's home, and it sort of dammed up the river and all this other stuff, and creating these labels. And imagine if I did that in 15, 20 other spots throughout the map. What I've done now is I've created something interesting of, hey, over in the Arenville Mountains in the region of Lascari, or the kingdom south of the kingdom of Dovesk, there is this mountain range, and the cool thing about that is there's this ancient hill giant that's been well known, like through legend and lore. He's talked about, and he's told as like the boogeyman in children's, bedtime stories to keep children to make them go to bed. Don't be up at night because Scud's around, whatever. There's a big story with Scud. Now, from a high-level campaign standpoint, Scud can be the climactic final encounter. But when you create something that powerful and you create a lot of depth and story about this, remember, it's the fountain of youth. Other people might want to drink from those waters of that river, right? But anywhere near that region, Scud, that's his home, right? You're not allowed to go into that area. That's his zone. He controls that. And if you're level 2 or 3 groups of, PCs, you're not going to be dealing with Scud. But maybe Scud also has a bunch of, if it's 250 years of ancient hill giant with this story attached to him, you're going to have an entire cult. Maybe you have these ogres, and maybe one of them is relatively powerful. He's like some ogre shaman or something like that. He's a witch doctor. And now we're talking CR9, CR10, CR11 guys. But now you've just created a mid-level encounter based on the river Scud and this ancient hill giant, and his name is Scud, and he's kind of dammed off this region, and you have this entire little mini, I remember playing like Grudhaug or whatever it was, and in Storm King's Thunder and stuff like that, right? You have just sort of this mini 8, 10, 15 page little module off of that. And that's the point I'm trying to, illustrate here, is if in your world building you can create a bunch of 10 to 12 page little modules and adventures and scenarios, you have a world that is full of adventure. And at the end of the day, that's all you want. You want to have fun and you want to have good pacing, but when you sit down at the table, you want your PCs to go out and be heroes and complete a bunch of different adventures. That's all you're trying to do. You're not just trying to read a novel to your players and talk to them about world building 101 and how your world was awesome 30,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago. You want your PCs to go out there and do some fun shit. So these are the little types of things you can do. I just created a river, and I had been thinking about this before I got on camera, but I created a river, I gave it a label, but once you label something, what the hell is Scud? And Scud sounds kind of grungy and, grimy a little bit, and maybe it sounds giant-ish to me, so I decided to create a giant. And I created this story, and as I said, the high-level encounter of him is combating Scud himself. The mid-level encounter is maybe the various smaller groups that have sort of latched on to the story and the history of Scud, and they revere him. They're hoping that they can gain favor from Scud by going to the nearby villages and capturing like anyone that's supposed to be a mage for sacrifice. So any PC that is said to be born, as a wizard or a sorcerer or whatever. But now that's a problem that the PCs have to look into. And then maybe at the absolute lowest level is maybe nearby villages to this river Scud, these hamlets and these fishing villages that kind of fish off the southern portion, down here, right? They fish off the southern portion of the river. They get the remnants of whatever Scud allows through. They fish there, but maybe they've been losing livestock as there's like large amounts of goblins that have been raiding the villages lately. And maybe the goblins are trying to gain favor with Scud. And they believe that by showing Scud their power, by bringing him all these different damn animals and sheep and livestock and cattle, Scud doesn't give a damn. He just wants to live there kind of in peace, as he has for 300 years. Don't bother me and I won't wreck your stuff. And I want to just keep eating these fish. But maybe the goblin forces are starting to get a little bit unruly because they believe Scud is watching. You know what I mean? But now what you've done is you've created some content and a quest hook when you go to the inn in this little village, when you go to the tavern in this little village, and why there's a level 1 through 4 little module based around goblins. But it all ties in, and now you have an entire campaign and story arc. But by simply creating the River Scud first and kind of making that label, and why is it named that? I can now say, well, I need to draw what Scud's home looks like. And then when I'm writing my document, I can say, well, who is Scud? What are some details about Scud? What can I do at the table? Is there a fight happening? What's his CR? Are there other monsters that go along with him? Like I said, the ogres and the ogre witch doctors. And then at the low level, you have the goblins. And then this whole thing informed me of, I need to now create some little fishing villages. Are they part of the kingdom of Lascari, or are they part of the kingdom of Dovesk? Does the king or the lord of that kingdom care? Is he trying to protect this fishing village? You now have entire mercenary groups that are journeying to these areas. And you see what I mean, how it just snowballs, and you start asking questions, and it starts creating answers, and those answers allow you to put things onto your map. I can easily get off camera here and just run with it, and I can create an entire mini region of places and kingdoms and castles and a city that is, a walled city, and everything is centered around Scud and what's happening here. But imagine if I took that whole instance and I did something similar over here, based on this lake, based on this coastline. Here I have one. I don't know what's here yet, but it's called the Kraken Coast. What does that tell you? And you just do that. You have this area which is kind of frozen. You have this area which is devoid of any mountains or forests. You have this area which has a mountain range, but why is it called Tenwai? Sounds kind of like Eastern or Asian influence or something like that, right? Why is Jahamor so big compared to this region? Why is Kittagel up in the northeast? Is that where the elves are? But that is how you start to world build, is not just big overview of the elves live there. Start focusing it in and narrowing it down to these little bits. These little bits, as I did here, of why is the river named that, and what's the village that's there, and who lives in that village, and so on and so forth. Create a bunch of myths and stories and rumors around a single place, and that will start to branch out into more and more content for you. That's my process of world building. It's not the right way, the only way, the best way. It's just how I do it. And in my hopes in finishing this map and eventually finishing whatever world is going to come out of this map, you'll see a bit of my process. And at the end of the day, I hope it inspires you, entertains you, and helps you in your own world building journey. That's all I have for you folks. Thanks everyone for watching, and take care.